Are you looking for a component that allows you to select a certain date? Or better yet, are you looking for a component that allows you to select multiple dates? Well then, how about range of dates? But not just that. How about multiple ranges of dates? Well, in this video, I'm going to show you all of those things, and in the last section of the video coming right up, I'm going to show you how to implement this type of component in conjunction with an input component. Excited? Well then, let's talk about dates. In order for us to implement our very own Quasar Date Component, let us first create a basic implementation of this component. Let me show you how. So as you can see here in our code, we have the form that we left in our previous video. So we left it as it is, right? So this time we're going to create our own Quasar Date Component. So how do we create just that? So first, we need to create our component first. So here in our code, we need to insert another div for us to create our component, right? So here we're going to create our own div. So let's insert one right here. Let's see, around here. And then let's create a, what do you call this? Let's create a, let's say the actual date component. So for this case, let's type the Q-date. So what we're going to get is the QDate component itself. So something like this. Obviously, it's going to ask for a V model. So we're going to provide that V model. So in our case, we're going to create our V model in the form data object right here. So we're going to create a date parameter here. So let's say 2021. And then let's set this to what date is today. Okay, so let's say 11. And then let's set this one to 6. So we have something like that. Next, QDate component, we're going to add the V model. So let's add a V model, and then let's put the form data dot date. So what we're going to get is a component with a date as a V model. So in this case, what Quasar is going to show us is exactly this component right here. So around here, you can see that we have created a date component. So next, now that we have implemented a basic setup of our date component, we can select different dates as much as we want. So that is one of the basic implementations of a QDate. Let's say you want to use a landscape, for example. So what do we mean by a landscape? So in this case, our date component is in a portrait state, right? So it uses a vertical alignment. So what if you want to use, let's say, the horizontal alignment? So in that case, we're going to use the landscape. So in order to set up a landscape, you simply need to add the landscape property. So in this case, it's simply adding a landscape property. Once you hit save, what you're going to get is another orientation of the date component, but this time it's oriented in a landscape sense, right? So it's using the horizontal alignment. So component itself behaves similarly to the previous one, except that it's aligned in a horizontal sense instead of the vertical sense, which is the default. So in the case of, let's say you want to select multiple dates, what we can do is we need to set up a V model that is an array. So similar to our previous videos, if you haven't watched that, please do check it out as well. So in our previous videos, what we did was we can use a V model, which is an array, in order to create our own, they call this multiple set of values. So in this case, we have a date as a string, right? So instead of a string, let's use the array notation. And then once we have that, as you can see, we have no date in our component, right? So if I select one, we have a single date, and then if I select another one, we have, let's say, or rather we have November 3, right? So in this case, we set our QDate into a landscape, but we are missing the multiple property. So if we add the multiple property, what you're going to get is something like this. As soon as I click a date, we're going to get the initial date, and then if I click another date, it's going to show us that we have selected two dates, or rather 2 days. So in this case, we have selected 2, and then if I click another one, we're going to have 3. But if I click the same date again, it's going to remove that date from the set of selections. So in this case, we're going to have 2 days in our, in our selection of values. So that is how Quasar behaves in a multiple type of sense. So let's say you want to select a range. For example, you want to select 5 to 10 days, or for example, you want the user to select a certain range of days. Let's say from November 1 to November 5. So in a scenario like that, Quasar is also able to handle that type of scenarios as well. So how do we do that? So in order to implement the scenario like that, what we need to do first is we need to modify our component a little bit. So instead of setting it as a multiple parameter, we're going to set it to range this time. So we're going to use a range. And then at the same time, going to modify our vModel. Instead of using an array, we're going to use an object this time. So in this case, let's set it to null for now. So we have the array, right? So let's move it to null for now. And then let's try setting a specific value. So as you can see, we can select a range of dates starting from November 1 to November 11. So how does that work? Okay, so in order to visualize what actually happens with our date model, we're going to display the model itself as is. So let's move in our code here. Let's display the form data dot date. So once we have that, we're going to see our date in the screen any moment now. So let's just wait for it to compile. Then we're going to get this one. Okay, oh, where is it? Hey, where's my date? Okay, let's see. I think it's not visible. Oh, okay, so there it is. My bad. So as you can see, once we have selected our range of values, let's say in this case we selected November 1 to November 9, what we're going to get is an object which contains a from date and a to date. So we have 2 values. So what Quasar returns to us is an object that contains 2 values, which is the start date and the end date in the form of from and to keys. So using these 2 values, you can set a specific range, or you can choose whatever range you may desire to choose from. So let's choose the value 3 to 8. So it's going to change the value immediately. But do take note that when using this type of input, you're always going to get an object which contains a from and a to value. So that is what you're going to use in order to, implement your own scenarios. So that is how a range works. So what if, let's say, you want to implement multiple ranges? Let's say I want to select November 1 to 5 and then 10 to 15, for example. So in that case, it is also possible. So how do we implement something like that, right? So first, what we're going to do is we're going to set an array. So let's set an array first. So we have the date here, right? So let's set this one to array, and then let's save it. And then what we're going to do next is we're going to modify our component a little bit. So we have the QDate component here, right? So we have range currently set. So in order to allow multiple ranges, we simply need to add the multiple parameter. So let's add the multiple, you hit save, and then it's going to reload again. And in the screen right here down on the lower left section, you will see that our vModel is currently an empty array, right? Let's say I select November 1 to 8, so I have 8 days. And then if I select, let's say, 17 to 22, what I'm going to get is another set of, another set of dates. So in this example, you will see that we have a first range starting from November 1 to November 8, and then we have another range starting from November 17 to November 22. So Quasar allows you to select multiple range of dates if that is what you need in your scenario. So again, in order to implement something like that, you simply need to set your vModel into an array, and then you need to set the range property right here, And then you need to set the multiple property as well. So by setting these two values and setting an array as a vModel, what you're going to get is a multiple range sets. So it allows you to select multiple sets of dates, as you can see in our example. So let's say you would like to, customize your Quasar Date Component values. Let's say you want to change the title, or in this case, you want to set a specific value. So how do you do that? So Quasar also allows you to customize the content of your title bar. So in this case, we're going to modify the title bar. So by modifying the title bar, we're going to lose this functionality right here. So by default, let's return this back to portrait. So what we get is something like this, right? So if we select a date, or rather, let's remove the range and multiple. So let's remove that one. Then let's set this back to 2021, 11/06. For example. So by default, that is the basic behavior of QDate, right? So what if I wanted to, let's say, modify this title right here? So how will I achieve that? So in order to set that type of input, you simply need to add a title and a subtitle property. So in our component, we're going to simply set the title to, let's say, a title here, for example, just for the sake of example. And then let's say we need to set the subtitle a subtitle here. So for example, something like that. So what we're going to get is we have a custom title, and at the same time we have a custom subtitle in our component. So Quasar also allows you to do just that. So let's see. In the case of, what do you call this? Let's say you have for example, there are certain scenarios that, let's say you haven't selected a date, right? Or upon page load, there's no initial date to set for now. So in those cases, let's say you want to set a default date. So how do we do just that? So Quasar also allows you to set a default date. So going back in our code, so going back here, we can set that as well. So we can do that by simply setting a default year month. So in our property here, we set a default year month. And then we set the exact date that we want to use here as a default. So let's set the default to 1990, and then let's use the month of, let's say, July, so 7. So once I hit that save, and then I remove the value of date, let's set this one to null, and then I hit save again, what we're going to get is we got the default value, which is the July of 1990. So if you check our Quasar date right here, we have July as well as we have the year 1990. This type of scenario is useful for those cases where you have no initial values set as of yet. So for example, the initial state of the form is null, for example. So in that case, if the vModel is null, then definitely you can set a default date to be used by the component. So that is one useful feature. So going back, also aside from that, you can also customize the default view. So what do we mean by default view? So what do we mean by default view is that by default, Quasar uses the component as is. So upon initial load, the component will look exactly like this. We're going to get a title here, which is the date by default, and then we're going to have a subtitle here, which contains another specific value, and then we have the date selector right here. But aside from that, we also have this neat little feature that allows us to pick the specific month, let's say July, and then allows us to pick a specific year. So let's say this one, or let's say the 1990, for example. So in the case of, let's say you want to display the date component using the year first, you can do that as well. So it is possible also. So we can customize the default view that Quasar uses in order to display its date. So instead of getting this default state right here, we can set the default date or the default view to, let's say, the years or months. So let's use the years property. So let's set the default view to years. So something like that. And then once we do that, what's going to happen is we're going to get this type of view, which is it displays the years first before anything else. Aside from that, we can also use the months. So let's add the months here. So months. So something like that. So what we're going to get is the months right here. So if I select, let's say May, I'm going to get the May of 1990. So that is also one of the features of the Quasar Date Component. So it allows you to set a specific default view, which is very useful in those cases where you want to, let's say you want to set a year first, or you want a selection that starts with the year first, then suddenly proceeds with the month. In other cases, you want to use the month first, and then you can choose the date. So you can customize it based on your needs as well. So how about those cases where, let's say I want to disable my QDate component for the meantime, or let's say I want to use I want this component to be read only. So it only allows the reading of values. Like other components, we can use the disable and read only property in this component as well. So in order to do that, you simply need to, let's remove these other properties first. Let's remove that one, and then let's set this one to disable. So once we do that, what we're going to get is a disabled component, wherein we cannot choose or set the date at all. So in the case you want to set this one to read only, what's going to happen is we can only read values from this component. So read only. Okay, so let's set the date to 2021, 11/06, for example. We're going to get is that exact value in our Quasar Date Component, and we cannot change its values in any way at all. So that is what it means by using a read-only property. So let's say you want to customize your values. Let's say you want to customize the format of your output. Let's say you want to use the year, month, day type of format, or let's say you want to use the month, day, year format. So how do we modify our output values from the Quasar Date Component, right? So in this code, we're going to show you how. Okay, so let's say you want to, for example, let's set the value to year, month, day. So in order to do that, we're going to set a mask. Let's use the mask property, and then we're going to set the specific value. So in this case, we're going to set the mask, going to set it as YY, meaning we're going to use the year value, and then let's use the dash, and then meaning the month in numeric format, and then we're going to use the DD, meaning the month or the day in numeric format as well. So once I hit save, and then let's see, for example, I select a specific value. Okay, so let's set this one to, okay, so for example, let's remove this one to, let's set this one to null first, and then let's remove the read only, something like that. If I select this date, so as you can see, our value right here is modified as well. So let's say I want to set the month first. So let's set this mask to YYYY, or rather let's say the DD, and then the YYYY, meaning we're going to set the month, the day, and the year. So let's remove these values. Let's hit save, and let's see what happens. So let's see, I select the November 6th. So as you can see, our V model contains the value 11/6/2021, meaning it formats our output values based on the mask that we use. So as you will notice, the Quasar Date Component allows us to modify our outputs based on what we want the output to be. So in this case, in our example, we set the month, the day, and the year, right? Or we set the year, the month, then the day. So aside from these values, Quasar also offers a handful of options that allows you to customize your actual output, which is what you call the masking feature. So it masks your values based on the format that you set upon the mask property. So are you having questions so far, or you have difficulties implementing? Please don't hesitate to leave a comment down in the comment section. We'll be happy to help you in any way. So going back, so here as you can see, we just created our mask, right? So what if, let's say, I want to set a mask which contains the words instead of the numbers? So we can do that as well. So in this case, let's see. So let's experiment with our mask feature. So let's say in our mask, let's set the specific value. So let's say for D, meaning the word. And then let's set to, let's say 3M. So in our earlier, we used the 2M, right? So this time we're going to use the 3M. And in this case, we're going to use the 4D, but it's a lowercase character. So let's see what happens when we do just that. So aside from that, let's set the day, which is capital D, just to check things out. And then let's use the same value, which is the Y. So in this case, what we're going to get is something like this. So as you can see, we have the Wednesday, we have November, and we have the value 3, and then lastly, we have the 2021 as value. So how does masking work, right? So to demonstrate, let's try experimenting with the values right here. For now, let's experiment with the letters. So let's use 4Y. So something like that, right? So what we're going to get is the year. So what if I set this one to 2 values? So what are we going to get? If I do that, we're going to get the last 2 digits of the year. But what if I set this one to 3 instead of 2, right? So, just for curiosity's sake. So if I do that, we're going to get a 21 and then Y, meaning the Y has no value in and of itself. So it has no specific value for that type of mask. But if you set this one to 4 letters, we're going to get the exact year in numeric format. So let's use the single M. So month, right? M stands for month. So if I select this date, let's say this one, or this one, or this one, we're going to get the month. But if I set this one to double M, or rather 2M, we're going to get the month again as well. But if I set this one to 3M, or 3 letter M characters, what we're going to get is the abbreviated value of the month itself, which is Nov in this case. So let's say I choose May, we're going to get May. But if I choose, let's say September, we're going to get SEP to abbreviate the September value. But what happens if I add another M? So what we're going to get this time is the full name of the month itself. So we're going to get November. So let's try the days, right? So let's say D. So let's say I used D. So if I select a date, nothing happens, meaning there's no such mask for that. If I use 2 letters, we're going to get the double-digit day value. So we're going to get 11, we're going to get 4, we're going to get 9. But if I set this one to 4-letter D, something like this, we're going to get the word, which is Wednesday, right? But let's put this back to how we found it earlier, something like this. So if we do that, and then we select a date, we're going to get this exact value right here. What it means is that the mask offers a specific set of characters for you to display specific values. So let's say, for example, Wednesday. So let's remove this one, and then let's set this one to only this type of value. So we're going to get this, and then let's set the date MMM to meaning the abbreviated month, and then let's set the D, 2-letter Ds, meaning the double-digit date, and then let's set this one to 4 letters of the year. So what we're going to get is the day in word format, we're going to get the month, we're going to get the exact day in 2-digit formula or in 2-digit values, and then we're going to get the year in digit format as well. So as you can see, masking is a very useful feature that allows you to customize your date outputs in a much simpler and cleaner way without having to code at all. So Quasar offers these functionalities by default, so we don't have to do any coding that much. We simply need to set the specific values for our masking property. So that's how masking works in the Quasar Date component. So this time, let's say you want to customize your component, right? So as you can see, we're still stuck with the blue color. So let's say I want to set the red color, right? I like the red. So, something's beautiful with the red. So in this case, let's set this one to red. So how do we do that? So in order to set the color of the component, we simply need to add the color property And then let's set this one to red. So what we're going to get is the red color for our component. So if I click a date, we're going to get the red variant of this component. So let's say I want to use, for example, how about the text color, right? So you don't want white, for example, you want green. So in this case, we're going to set the text color property to green. So once we do that, we're going to get the green text inside of a red background, which doesn't work quite as we expected. So let's set this one to, let's say, black instead. So black. So what we're going to get is a black inside a red. So that's how coloring works in the Quasar component. So let's say you have a dark background. So how do we set the component on a dark background? So we simply need to add a dark property right here. By setting the dark property, you're going to get the component in a darkened state. So as you can see, it's colored black, which is very useful for those types of scenarios where you have where your application rather is in the dark mode. This type of scenario is very useful for those types of situations, or rather for those types of use cases. So, for example, what if I have a certain scenario where I need to highlight certain days to notify, or in order to mark it as an important day or as an event? So, Quasar component also allows you to set a highlight on specific dates to mark them as important dates or events. So, going back in our code, we can do that by setting an events array, or an array that contains a set of dates. So in this case, let's set the events property to, let's say the November 1 is important. So let's set the date 2021 11 1, and then let's say the November 30. So let's set November 30, for example. So let's set this value to 30. So what we just did was we created an array of dates, right? So there's nothing much going on here. But in order to mark that specific dates that we just set earlier as an event in our QDate component, what we're going to need, or what we're going to add, is the events property. So let's add the events, and then let's set the form data dot events. So something like this. So in order to show you guys, let's just clean up the code a little bit. So let's move this one here. Let's move this down. Let's move this down. Let's move this. Oh, let's arrange this one. There we go. So here what we did was we added an events, right? So as you can see, the dates November 1 and November 30 are highlighted, meaning they are events or important dates that is set by the values in our events models, which is this one right here. So let's say I want to change the highlight color. It is also possible to change those colors. So we can do that by simply adding the events color property. So event color, let's use yellow, to mark it as an important, or to highlight the value. So as you can see, we have a yellow colored highlight in our specific dates. So this type of scenario again is also useful for those types of setups where you need to highlight specific dates, for example, holidays or important meetings or something like that. So you can set those highlighted values using an array of dates in string format. So what if, let's say, I want to disable certain dates, right? So I want a specific date to be non-selectable. So how do we do that? So Quasar also offers that kind of configuration. So there are instances where you want to, let's say, you want to remove certain dates, right? So let's say a certain date is not selectable, let's say November 5, for example. So how do we implement something like that, right? So let's go back in our code and implement that exact scenario. Going back here, in order to disable certain dates, what we're going to do is we need to set a specific type of options. So for example, let's use a single date as a selectable option. So in order to implement a certain range of selectable items, you need to add a options array. which contains all the dates that you want to be selectable. So let's say, let's set this one for example. Let's use these two values, something like that. So we just duplicated them, right? Next, what we need to add is the options property, and then we're going to feed our options array inside of it. So let's use the form data.options. What we're going to get is something like this, right? So we have as you can see, we cannot select anything at all. So let's just check. Okay, so let's see. Oh, I have duplicate. So okay, date options, for example. So I was using the wrong variable name. Okay, so let's grab this one and then let's set this here and let's set it to save. And as you can see, we only have two selectable dates, the November 1 and November 30, because that was the value of dates that we set in our date options array. So that is one way of limiting your certain inputs inside your Quasar date. So this scenario is useful for those cases where you would like to set specific values as a selectable options in your Quasar date component. For example, you would like to allow allow users to select certain dates only to mark that it is a special date, for example, or it is the only date that it is usable, or the only time that you can select that specific date. So there are multiple scenarios that you can implement this type of situation or input. So this is one feature that Quasar already has by default. So Quasar also allows you to limit the specific number of months that you can visit in your Quasar date component as well. Let's say you want the users to view only the months of November and December. That is also possible. So let's say I want the users to only view the days between October to December. So Quasar's date component allows you to do that as well. So in order to set something like that, we need to set the navigation min year month and navigation max year month. Meaning we can set the minimum and the maximum allowable months and years that you can traverse inside the component. So by doing just that, what we're going to get is this output right here. So let's say our maximum is 2021, and then let's set this one to 12, meaning December, and then let's set the minimum. So let's say minimum is 2021 10. So meaning we can view the dates only starting from November or October to December. So as you can see, July, August, September, and all of the dates prior to October are non-selectable. But as you can see also that I can only select October, November, and December. So what about years? So in the case of years, all of the years are disabled, right? So as you can see, we can't select any year at all because our minimum and maximum values are set to the same year. So in the case of, let's say, you would like to set 5 years, so we can set this one as well, or let's say 2 years. So let's set this one to 2022. So once I do that, what it means is that I can select only these 2 years. So as you can see, in the year 2021, I can only select up to October. But in the coming year, which is 2022, I can select I can select all of the months because the maximum month that I've set is December. As soon as I hit the next year, meaning 2023, I cannot select anymore at this date. So Quasar allows you to customize these specific boundaries as well. So there are some useful scenarios where you can implement this type of scenario or this type of implementation. Let's say you want to limit the user's input of dates to between 5 years. So let's say 2020 to 2025. Let's say from July to December. So something like that. So Quasar allows you to set these types of date ranges rather, and it also allows you to limit these boundaries based on your implementations and your specific values that you have set in the component themselves. Aside from that, you can also implement this QDate component inside a QInput. So let's say Let's say I have a specific scenario where I would like to, have an input, let's say an input bar, and then I would like to add a button there that indicates that I can select a date, right? So in this case, what we can do is we can bind the QDate component inside the QInput. So how do we do that? So Quasar also allows you to bind that type of input. So how do we do that? So first and foremost, we need to create an input. So in this case, we simply need to add the input. Let's set the QInput, and then let's set the vModel to date, or form data that date. So something like that. Now that we have an input, what we can do next is we're going to set a template mode. So inside the QInput, we're going to add a button. Let's have the input here. So we have QInput. So as you can see, we have a QInput element, right? Next, we're going to add a template. So template, and then let's use the vSlot. Let's use the append, for example. So here we're going to add a certain icon in our input. So QIcon, name date, for example, or calendar. Let's use the calendar. And then let's set the class to cursor pointer to indicate that whenever our mouse hovers over this icon, it's going to use the hand icon, the thing like this, the hand icon like this. So that is what it means when you use a cursor pointer, because there are some elements that every time you hover the mouse above it, it doesn't change into the hand indicator. So we have to force that using a class. So now that we have an icon, what we're going to have next, or rather what we're going to add next, is what we call a Q pop-up proxy. So what is this Q pop-up proxy? What it means is that if I click the button, it's going to show a pop-up. So it's basically a proxy to another element. So it's just it's just a utility element of Quasar that allows you to create pop-ups basically anywhere. So in this case, we created a proxy pop-up, and then we're going to add a transition. Let's set the the transition show. Okay, so let's set this one to, let's say, scale. Just to add some bit of animation. And then we're going to add another one, which is transition, let's say hide, and then let's set this one to scale as well. Just to add a little bit of flair, the flair. And then once we have that, what we're going to do next is we're going to add the QDate component itself inside of it. So let's grab this one, and then let's put it right here. So now that we have our QDate inside, let's say so let's say I want to add a close button, for example, because what we're going to get is we have no close button, right? So as you can see, I click here, there's nothing. So let's remove the dark feature. We're going to get, let's say, the event. Okay, so there we go. So for example, I select a certain value, which is November 1. So I'm going to get that as a value. So if I remove this one, just to make things much cleaner, and then let's remove the mask value, and then let's set this one to default. Let's remove everything for now. Let's remove that one, and then let's set this to red, for example. So something like that. So here we have a QInput. Let's say that it's rounded and then outlined. So we're going to get something like this. And then let's say label is date, just for the sake of example. So we have a date input right here. So how do we set the input? We simply click the date button right here, and then we can select a specific date. So let's say 18. So as you can see, our component here has a value of November 18, and at the same time, the input contains a certain value, which is November 18 as well. So this is how you implement a Quasar date inside of a QInput. So this is one of the most common scenarios where you would like to add a date selection inside an input. So if you have any, if you have any desire to do so or implement this type of feature, well, you can use this as a reference for that. Thank you guys for watching this tutorial video. I hope you have learned something from it as well as have learned how to implement your own Quasar Date component in your own applications. If you have any further questions or clarifications, please feel free to leave a comment down in the comments section. If you like this video that you have seen so far, please don't hesitate to leave a like as well as to hit that subscribe button to get notified of our latest updates as well as when new tutorial videos gets uploaded. This is Joshua from Pixelate. See you later, Pixelators!